welcome to Colorado Mesa University. I'm thrilled to have my co-panelists here, Nadine Strossen, who needs no introduction, and Christy Hine, who a member of our faculty, has served on the staff and has shown just a tremendous amount of leadership around this issue of free expression on campus, has led the faculty working group on free expression, and just really appreciate your work here tonight. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Christy, and you can take it.
We'll start it off. Thank you so much. We are incredibly honored to have you here, and I've spoken to you many times, and I'm just becoming more and more impressed. And as co-chair of the Free Speech and Civil Discourse Committee, and as a campus that truly, and I think you know this already, embraces free speech, I want to start the conversation with a quote from your book. It's an amazing book, by the way. She didn't tell me to say that or anything, but I'm going to tell you. You state in your book, and it's your recent book on free speech, what everyone needs to know, no matter how speech protective laws, our laws may be, freedom of speech still will not be a vital reality unless we reinforce free speech law with a free speech culture. So as we begin to frame our time together, can you give us your definition of free speech, and how can we develop kind of this free speech culture that you speak of?
Well, thank you so much, Christy and John, and we agreed that we would all be on a first name basis. It's a sign of mutual respect and colleagueship, and I certainly consider John and Christy and so many of the members of this special community to be my colleagues in advocating and exercising and understanding and defending free speech. So free speech law, such as what is embodied in our famous First Amendment to our Constitution, free speech law that is speech protective is necessary but not sufficient for us to actually enjoy meaningful freedom of speech. Without the protection of law, which, by the way, was the situation throughout most of American history, we had free speech in theory, but not in reality. Many of you know, I assume all of you know, that the First Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1791 as part of the Bill of Rights. But many people don't realize that until the second half of the 20th century, government could get away with punishing people, even imprisoning people for exercising what we would now consider to be centrally important free speech rights. So let me give you one example. Most people know that Martin Luther King wrote a wonderful, eloquent, historic, landmark letter from a Birmingham jail, right? But how many of you know why he was in jail? What was the crime he committed for which he was imprisoned? Well, he was imprisoned for exercising what we now consider to be the most important free speech right in a democratic republic, the right of we the people who wield sovereign power to criticize and dissent from and seek to reform government policies, for trying to peacefully protest against racially discriminatory Jim Crow laws. He was imprisoned. And it wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that the Supreme Court started breathing real life into the abstract words in the First Amendment. You know, James Madison, who many people call the father of the First Amendment, he was the principal author of the Bill of Rights as well as the Constitution. He said, you know, all of this, all of these legal protections, these are mere parchment barriers between the people's actual rights and abuse of government power. These rights are not self-enforcing. It depends on all of us and all of you to turn these paper rights into real rights for yourselves and for everybody else. And if I can just add one word about the culture even beyond the law. Surveys show, many of you know that surveys show that college students, college professors, the public at large, all of us are engaging in massive self-censorship. And that's all across the ideological spectrum, all across the identity spectrum. There are sensitive subjects that we feel afraid to candidly talk about, not because we're afraid that the government is going to imprison us, thank goodness those days are behind us, not because we're afraid that our professors are going to punish us. We know that our professors encourage open dialogue, but rather we are afraid of being accused, either unfairly as well as fairly accused, of being insensitive or saying something that's offensive. And so we have, and it's completely appropriate to try not to hurt somebody's feelings. If you can express an idea in a way that's not hurtful or offensive, please do that. But do not stop yourself from discussing an idea. Do not stop yourself from expressing a perspective. We have to overcome this culture of fear, which is often called a cancel culture, to encourage the kind of conversation that John and Christy, you were doing so much to foster here on your campus.
Nadine, I want to follow up on the hate speech conversation in a moment, but first I think it might be helpful to orient our audience a little bit. You come to this work through a fairly interesting perspective, and you're also grounded because you have some really, what would we say, a really impactful life story, and I want to draw this through line. So ACLU, which you've got a long history with, has experience going back into the 1970s in a famous situation in Skokie, Illinois, defending the Nazi Party's right to march in this town that was known to have a disproportionate number of Jews in it. And the ACLU supported the rights of that Nazi Party to march. I wonder if you might just go back a little bit and kind of refresh our memories on maybe not just that topic, but the way that the lawyers that defended that case and defended that party came to their work, the why behind it, because I think it helps maybe ground us in the rest of this conversation.
That's such an important question, and it really zeroes in on what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment. So Christy was nice enough to talk about this book, which is several hundred pages long and a primer on free speech principles. But if I had to tell you only one principle, the most important one, it's what the Supreme Court has called this bedrock principle of viewpoint neutrality. Sometimes it's called content neutrality. That government must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the content, the idea, the message of the speech. No matter how unpopular, no matter how hated, no matter how hateful the viewpoint is, in our democratic republic, it is not for the government to take away from we, the people, the power to decide what we will say, what we will not say, what we will listen to, what we will not listen to. If we hate the idea, we have many alternatives. We can respond to it, we can refute it, we can try to persuade the person who is voicing that idea to change their mind. We can ignore it or walk away from it. So that is the principle, but in reality, it is very hard for most of us to actually encourage the government and support the government in honoring that principle. Most of us actually do believe in freedom of speech for me or people who agree with me, but not for thee or people who disagree with me. And the Skokie case, as it's called, named after the city in Illinois near Chicago where it took place, really is a paradigmatic case about that viewpoint neutrality principle. As John said, the ACLU, which from its beginning, more than 100 years ago, has completely been committed to full and equal human rights for everybody, regardless of race, regardless of religion. So the ideas of the Nazis could not be more antithetical to the ACLU's own civil libertarian ideals. Yet part of those civil libertarian ideals are commitments to viewpoint neutral freedom of speech, freedom to defend, to engage in even the idea that we hate. So we came to the defense of this group of neo-Nazis to demonstrate peacefully in Skokie, Illinois, even though Skokie had a large population of Jewish people, and John, even more poignantly and dramatically, this was back in 1977, it was the largest population of Holocaust survivors anywhere in the United States. It was an easy case in the courts of law. The case went all the way up to the US Supreme Court, and because of this core viewpoint neutrality principle, of course, Skokie did not have the right to censor the Nazis from speaking solely because of their loathsome, repugnant ideas. In fact, it was such an easy case legally, the Supreme Court did something that it very rarely does, which is it gave the victory to the Nazis without even receiving written briefs or oral arguments. But in the court of public opinion, it was an extremely controversial and unpopular case, even among ACLU members. People who care so strongly about freedom of speech that they forked over their $20 membership dues. By the way, it's still only $20, and that is an ad, in order to become card-carrying members of the ACLU. And yet they said, yes, we really believe in freedom of speech, except this is the one exception that we think should be made for the viewpoint that is the most loathsome. And the problem is, and here I'm going to quote a friend of mine who at the time was the executive director of the National Coalition Against Censorship, Leanne Katz. She said, you know, Nadine, everyone has his or her Skokie. That just one exception that they want to make to the viewpoint neutrality principle for the just one idea that they consider to be the most dangerous, the most vile, the most harmful. And throughout my adult lifetime, if I had added up all of the just one exceptions that people want to make to freedom of speech, we would have no freedom of speech at all. So I think one has to, and people have asked me, John, isn't it hard for you, Nadine, to defend free speech for Nazis? Because my father was a Holocaust survivor. This is extremely personal to me. And if I may say so, it's a very dramatic story. My father, as a teenager, in Germany. He was born in 1922 in Berlin and was anti-Hitler, was active in anti-Hitler political movements. I'm very proud of him. He was also a half-Jew. His father was Aryan. His mother was Jewish. His father was under a lot of pressure to divorce his mother. His father, who was very courageous, did not. For these crimes, my father was sent as a teenager to the Buchenwald forced labor camp, where the Nazis had a strategy of trying to work people to death. And so they had extermination by gas chambers, but also by, they called it, and forgive my horrible German accent, my father, for understandable reasons, didn't want me to learn the language, but Zerstörung durch Arbeit, to destroy through work. Absolutely backbreaking labor with malnutrition, starvation, disease being rampant, he almost died. And to add to that, the Germans also had a program of forced sterilization for undesirables. Well, my father was doubly undesirable as a political opponent and as a half-Jew. And he literally had an appointment to be sterilized. One day before that appointment, Buchenwald was liberated by Americans. So I literally owe my life as well as my liberty to the American military. I always salute it with gratitude. And no, it is not hard at all for me to defend the freedom of speech principle that extends to Nazis as well as to anti-Nazis, because I see that principle and I see that throughout history to this day, the people and the groups that most depend on it are those who are members of minorities, including religious minorities and ethnic minorities. By definition, we are never going to have the political power to commandeer the majoritarian levers of power. We depend more than anybody else on robust freedom of speech that is robust enough to extend to our speech, because our speech is denounced as hateful and as treasonous and as dangerous.
I want to ask maybe a quick follow-up, because I think one of your colleagues described the Skokie case as being easy in some part because it was the exact same argument that 10 years prior was being used in places like Birmingham to prevent Dr. King from marching, because it was going to cause unrest and it was going to be objectionable. And I'm so grateful that you tell that extraordinary story, because we have short memories and we forget these things. But I think it just helps to bring a level of maybe authenticity to this discussion. So I
John, if
appreciate
I
it.
could add to that, not only in Birmingham, Alabama, but in Illinois itself. Because states are very diverse, and in one part of the state might have a politics or a view on racial issues that is diametrically opposite from another part of the state. So the ACLU pointed out in our brief in the Skokie case that 10 years earlier, we had invoked the very same viewpoint neutrality principle in Cicero, Illinois, which was described by Time magazine as Selma, Alabama, without the Southern accent. White supremacy was very popular, and the pro-King, anti-segregation demonstrators were as hated and as feared in Cicero as the Nazis were in Skokie.
That's a lot. It's just a lot. One of the things that we wanted to talk a little bit about is the idea of hate speech, right? And we've kind of breached that topic just a little bit, but we're really seeing that on college campuses, that there's an aversion to anything that is offensive. That's offensive. I don't want to talk about it. And I'm sure, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, the emotional trauma and that comes with, the idea of Nazis and everything else. And we're seeing that on a different level, I think, in college campuses. And we were talking a little bit about, just the idea that there's so many hate speech laws that are happening across, the world right now. And how do we deal with it on a college campus when everyone says, I don't want to talk about that. That's offensive. That's too much for me. I'll be traumatized. And emotional harm is physical harm and is violence, and I don't want to talk about it.
So first of all, if I may start with what the countervailing principle is to the bedrock principle of viewpoint neutrality, because I do want to acknowledge that American First Amendment law quite sensibly does not absolutely protect all speech, and certain speech can and should be restricted. It's going beyond that becomes problematic. But the more you know about our free speech law, the more it makes absolute common sense. On the one hand, it prohibits the government from engaging in the censorship that is the most dangerous. And I've already described that. That's censorship in which the government discriminates against particular viewpoints that are unpopular. That is the most dangerous form of censorship in a democratic republic, a representative democracy. However, when you get beyond the viewpoint or content of the speech and you look at it in its overall context, the Supreme Court has said that when the speech in context causes an emergency, that it directly causes or imminently threatens certain specific serious harm, then the speech can and should be restricted. And many of you have heard some of the subcategories of speech that the Supreme Court has recognized that satisfy the emergency principle. One is intentional incitement of imminent violence, where the violence is likely to actually happen imminently. Another example is targeted harassment or bullying, where the speaker directly targets a particular individual or small group of individuals and directly interferes with their privacy and freedom of movement. Let me mention one other example, which we lawyers call a true threat, and we put the adjective true in front of it to distinguish it from the looser way that students may say, I feel threatened by that idea, or I feel threatened by that speaker who's saying something offensive. That's not punishable. But if the speaker directly targets a particular individual or small group of individuals and intends to instill a reasonable fear that they are going to be subject to harm, to violence, and the speaker need not intend to actually bring about the violence, but merely instilling a reasonable fear that you're going to be subject to violence already inhibits your freedom of speech, right? As well as your freedom of movement. So sadly, there is quite a lot of expression on campus that does satisfy these emergency principles and can and should be subject to censorship. But what you're talking about, Christy, and what so many students and others in our larger population are demanding is an exception to the viewpoint neutrality principle. If we find the idea offensive, if we find the idea insensitive, if we think the idea is conveying a hateful perspective, that should be enough to justify censoring it. I'm not here to defend hateful ideas. To the contrary, I wrote a whole book called Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with free speech, not censorship. And what's so interesting in the research for that book, Christy, was that I cited international human rights activists and human rights activists from countries all over the world who opposed censoring hate speech, not because it violated the free speech rights in their own countries, no, because most other countries do allow censorship of hateful perspectives. But from the viewpoint of what is likely to be effective and what is likely to be counterproductive, their conclusion was, no matter how well intended anti-hate speech laws might be, in fact, they are at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive. Think about it. We're trying to change ideas. We're trying to eliminate or at least reduce hateful attitudes and actions. Censoring words is never going to have that impact. Unfortunately, you're trying to de-amplify the hateful message, and yet experience continually shows that exactly the opposite happens. Censorship efforts draw attention to the hateful speech that it otherwise never would have received. The hateful speakers receive sympathy that they otherwise would never have received. And perhaps most tragically, but predictably, these laws are consistently, disproportionately enforced against speech by the very members of the minority groups who are intended to be protected by the laws. And that's not a coincidence. That is a reflection of a point I made earlier, that the majoritarian powers are necessarily going to exercise any subjective, discretionary speech suppressive power in a way that is not friendly to minority groups. And that's why throughout the 20th century civil rights movement, leaders of that movement, as well as leaders of every other movement for equality and social change throughout our history, has opposed censorship, even censorship of hate speech, because they knew that it would be used disproportionately to silence them. I think if I had to choose one single quote from one of these great leaders, it would be Frederick Douglass. As you know, was born into slavery himself in 1818, escaped 20 years later and became a really brilliant political philosopher, as well as a superbly eloquent advocate for abolition of slavery. And he said, slavery cannot abide free speech. 5 years of its exercise would abolish the auction block and break every chain in the South. So yes, let's oppose offensive speech, let's oppose insensitive ideas, but oppose through more speech, through persuasion rather than suppression.
Can you maybe drill down on that a little bit? Because the term that you hear now is not censorship on college campuses. The term you hear today might sound something like deplatforming or disinviting, but it's effectively the same, right? I'm wondering if you have some practical experiences, if you just close your eye and you think in your mind's eye about some students who say, I really, really dislike this idea. I really dislike this particular ideology or some set of ideas. What are some practical tools that you think are effective at, as you say, bringing more speech to bad ideas to counter them rather than trying to, remember the term you used, de-amplify maybe?
Yeah. A few years ago, there was great concern among the civil rights community that a number of white supremacist organizations were bringing speakers to campus. Richard Spencer was one, and there were a number of others. And the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, which are two leading organizations that specialize in countering hateful groups and hateful ideologies, wrote a pamphlet. It was available online that they distributed to student activists on campuses around the country. And it was pretty much exactly that question, John. What to do if a hate monger, a white supremacist, has been invited to your campus? And the message that was stressed over and over and over again, more than anything else, was whatever you do, do not deplatform. Do not have a protest that shouts them down or shuts them down. We know that that may feel morally very satisfying to you as an individual, but please take it based on our extensive experience that that strategy is completely unwise and counterproductive and is in fact playing into the game book of those very people. That's what they're hoping to get, is the attention they receive from efforts to deplatform them. And I just have to say anecdotally, I think we all tend to know situations where Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter and other controversial speakers have been deplatformed or attempted to be deplatformed. There are many, many other situations where all of those people and other controversial speakers spoke on the very same campuses, in fact, and we don't know about it because there were no counter protests. They were denied the attention that they were seeking. And so among the strategies that are suggested in that excellent publication, one is that, approach the student group or the faculty member or whoever it is who invited that speaker. It's quite possible that they don't understand how negative the ideas are and what an adverse impact the presence of that person might have on campus. I'm not saying that that would be a strategy that would apply in many situations, because I also think that if you're talking about somebody who has a serious role in our society, in our political system, then there's a benefit to bringing that person to campus, especially if you think the person's ideas are dangerous, because you want to have the opportunity to hear how the person defends the ideas. You want to have the opportunity to formulate questions and challenge those ideas through questioning, and that will help you to develop a more effective rebuttal. One of the other strategies that is suggested by these two expert organizations is if you feel that you want to do something demonstrative other than attending the event and asking challenging questions, then have a counter event elsewhere on campus where you are affirmatively, proactively celebrating your positive vision of human rights as a counter to the negative vision that this speaker is purveying.
So you mentioned the title to a book that was published, I think, in 1992 by a guy named Nat Hentoff, Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee. And it reminds me this conversation is not new. But there are some new twists that are happening today, where some of the corners where we're seeing, shall we say, an openness to censorship is maybe in corners we wouldn't have expected it 30 years ago. Maybe if you would reflect on for us, what about this moment feels very much like the same conversation and a redux, and what about this moment do you see as different and novel?
Two excellent questions. And what is the same is that throughout my long career, since I graduated from law school way back in 1975, so many, many decades, I have consistently been defending the viewpoint neutrality principle against critics from both ends of the political spectrum who were living up to Nat Hentoff's edict, and the only difference being, usually the only difference being, what speech they each considered to be dangerous. But if I can give you one example where there was a convergence, and it's an issue that is becoming very salient again today. It involves sexually oriented expression that is demonized by a term that has no legal significance, but tends to have pejorative connotations in everyday speech, and that is pornography. So starting in the late 1980s through the 1990s, you had this strange convergence of, on the one hand, so-called radical feminists who were very far to the left, and they hated pornography and wanted it to be censored because they saw it as undermining women's equality and women's safety and women's dignity. In other words, it was inconsistent with feminist values. At the very same time, you had the so-called religious right, political and cultural and religious conservatives who wanted to censor pornography, which they saw as undermining what they called traditional family values. And so you had sexual expression being attacked from across the political spectrum, pretty much endangering all sexual expression, because if it was for feminist values, including reproductive freedom and LGBTQ sexuality, that was seen as inconsistent with traditional family values, and the right hated it. But that expression, which was venerating sex only in the context of a mother and father and kids, that was inconsistent with feminist values. So that has been a familiar pattern, John, of having to defend viewpoint neutrality from attacks all across the ideological spectrum. But what has changed is something that you've alluded to. Until recently, there were certain institutions in our society where freedom of speech was especially secure, including secure in protecting and defending the key viewpoint neutrality principle. And one by one, we have seen support for free speech and viewpoint neutrality wither in these institutions, starting with academia. I think the inroads on that principle in academia began in the 1980s, moving to journalism, to publishing, to culture, entertainment, librarianship, and dare I say, even among human rights and civil liberties organizations, we are seeing a weakening of the traditional support for the cardinal viewpoint neutrality principle. Now, if I can say so, for every generalization there are exceptions, but the surveys and other data show that the fault lines tend to be among on the basis of age, not on the basis of race or politics or gender or other demographic factors, but basically the older cohorts in each of these institutions tends to be more speech supportive, and the younger cohorts to be less speech supportive. And so for all of you young people here who do strongly support freedom of speech, I hope that you are vanguards for your generation. But after all, I'm here to, everything is subject to debate. So for those of you who don't share these principles, let the discussion and the debate flourish.
I think I just read today that American University, they have banned all indoor protest without defining what protest is. They are demanding student groups become welcoming to all without defining what that means. And all posters and flyers must promote inclusive. Be inclusive. I'm going there today. All to prevent kind of these campus tensions. And I think that's one thing that we're very fortunate here that we have that ability to have hard conversations, and we've got leadership that really promotes the idea of free speech and having hard conversations.
But it is a paradox, and I am being completely sincere when I say I welcome challenges to every single thing that I'm saying. The first chapter in my book, the first substantive chapter, is the 12 hardest, strongest arguments against free speech, and my best answers to those arguments. But in the introduction, I sincerely welcome my mantra for all of my students, and it is for all of my readers as well, is I want you to be able to answer every question, but I want you to be able to question every answer. And the way I do that in my classes, and I do it for myself too, to stretch my mind, is, well, what is the strongest counter argument you can make, right? And there has to be something even if you don't think it's stronger than the initial argument, what is the strongest counter argument you can make? And in that spirit, I brought a prop up here, which Christy saw. I want to be sure to use it. Now, you know, for those who are for or anti-Trump, don't get too excited or too heartbroken. What does it say,
Make
Chris?
J.S. Mill great again.
So it's Make J.S. Mill Great Again. And J.S. Mill stands for John Stuart Mill, a great 19th century British philosopher who, and there's a lot of evidence that he co-authored this book, great work on free speech called On Liberty in 1859. I will say, in the spirit of Women's History Month, there's growing evidence that he actually co-authored it with his wife, Harriet Taylor. Which is quite significant. I'm not a philosopher, but I gather that there are relatively few women at that period in our history who made such gigantic contributions to philosophy. But in On Liberty, which I reread periodically, it really stands the test of time. They explain why every single idea, especially the ideas that we most cherish and we most deeply hold, must be subject to constant re-examination and re-evaluation and criticism. No exceptions.
I think some people may have been triggered, what the heck, momentarily. I thought we converted you for a second, you know.
So Nadine, let's, by the way, I think you just politely called me old a minute ago, but
Older than the students.
let's for a moment try and steel man that perspective. If you're 19 and you're on a college campus and you're hearing things that are antithetical to what you believe to be central to human rights in some respect, and you're hearing things that you find to be contrary to those human rights, steel man that, how one might try and navigate through, like, walking by somebody who is politely a provocateur, and frankly trying to get a rise out of you and saying things that are horrible in some respects. Let's steel man that just a little bit and try and chase that.
I would say in every single situation, you want to make a strategic, specific decision about what are your goals in that situation and how are you likely to advance those goals. So if somebody is trying to be a provocateur and get a rise out of you, I think you defeat them by not letting them get a rise out of you, right? By walking on by and ignoring them, depriving them of the oxygen that they are seeking for their ideas. They're trying to make you angry. They're trying to rile you up. I have a couple of quotes in my hate speech book that are very good about this, and my paraphrase isn't going to quite do them justice, but one is from Eleanor Roosevelt, and she said something like, nobody can hurt your feelings unless you give them permission to do it. And let me also quote my friend John Rauch, and I'm going to give a trigger warning because he uses an offensive slur. For those of you who don't know John, a great civil libertarian, his most recent book is The Constitution of Knowledge. He's almost as old as I am, and throughout his entire life was on the forefront of crusading for marriage equality. He's a gay man. I mean, long before that position was accepted, even within the LGBTQ rights movement, if for a long time it was seen as a very out there position, no pun intended. So his credentials could not be stronger as an advocate of those rights. And he's making this point that, you know, if somebody, you have the power to not allow somebody to undermine your self-respect and your dignity. You're not going to let them do that. That's in your control. You're looking down on them. And he said, if somebody calls me a fucking faggot, I process that as she needs counseling, not that I'm a fucking faggot.
So the follow-on question
getting good, getting comfortable.
The follow-on comment, I guess, I'm reminded of Ira Glasser's comment about hate speech being speech that you hate. And I just wonder if you might go a little further on that idea, because the UN is chasing this a little bit, other countries are chasing this a little bit, and the pretext is always sort of a moralized version of what's good. But this conversation that feels inevitable, which is, well, who's watching the watchers, who gets to decide these sorts of questions, seems to me to be a useful discussion. So chase that a little bit for us, both from a constitutional standpoint as well as maybe broader kind of principle.
You know, the real problem of defining restrictable hate speech beyond the emergency principle is that it gives unfettered discretion to whoever is enforcing that standard to decide what is hateful and what is not. Now, that might seem quite obvious, but let me give you some examples of diametrically opposite messages that some people consider to be hateful and others consider to be loving. One really good example is Black Lives Matter advocacy, which many of us believe to be loving in the sense of promoting equal and robust dignity and equality for every person. Isn't that the antithesis of hate? And yet, government officials and other powerful, influential people have argued that Black Lives Matter advocacy is hate speech against white people or against police officers on camp. You know, what could be more loving? And I know I'm going to get a pushback, but in some ways you can say, what's more loving than all lives matter, right? Isn't that universalist and inclusive? And yet, on many campuses and elsewhere, that message has been attacked as hate speech. And I understand the plausibility of that perspective, that it's undermining or denying the special burdens and oppression that have been meted out against Black people in this country. And by the way, to use a couple other subjective terms that recently have become bases for advocating censorship, disinformation and misinformation, the exact same problem. One person's fake news or disinformation is somebody else's cherished truth. Black Lives Matter advocacy has been attacked by powerful politicians as disinformation. The argument is that, oh, it's really Marxist. It's not just an anti-capitalist. It's not really anti-racism. So that's the reason, John, that we don't want to give such subjective discretion to whoever has the enforcing authority. That is ultimately more dangerous than the speech itself. And if I can underscore that, I keep coming back to Winston Churchill's famous aphorism about democracy, that it's the worst form of government except for all the others. You know, one of the distorted claims that's made about those of us who defend free speech, including the United States Supreme Court, which pretty much is unanimously in support of freedom for controversial speech, we're often accused of denying that speech does harm. Not true. As the Supreme Court itself said fairly recently, we defend freedom of speech not despite its power to cause harm, but precisely for that reason. Speech is powerful, and it has power to do great harm as well as great good. But even more harmful than speech is giving government unfettered discretion to pick and choose which speech it considers harmful, and therefore deprives the rest of us of the opportunity to engage in convey and receive that speech.
I think we talked earlier today, there was a young man that talked to me about Donald Trump's speech on January 6th, and he was very insistent that he should be punished for that speech. And, you know, kept on asking him several questions. And when you meet people that are so adamant in wanting to censor speech, what would have been the best argument to counter for that young man?
I think the most effective way to bring home the adverse consequences of censoring particular speech that the advocate sees as dangerous and harmful is to extract the principle and apply it to another concrete situation where that very same person would say, hey, wait a minute, I don't want to censor that speech. So let me be very specific. January 6th, the category of emergency speech that meets the emergency standard that Trump's speech arguably satisfied, according to people who wanted to be punished, I referred to earlier, intentional incitement of imminent violence, where the violence or lawlessness is likely to happen imminently. As is true for all of these categories of speech that satisfies the emergency standard, it is very fact-specific. You really have to look at all the facts and circumstances. And so far, several judges have actually examined the factual record here, and I think they've reached different conclusions as to whether Trump's speech would satisfy that standard, because you look at not only what he said, but every single word, and you look at the overall physical context, what the atmosphere was on the part of the crowd. Some of the judges have looked to his prior speeches before January 6th. And one of the factors that weighs against treating that as intentional incitement is he was very careful with his wording. Some of you may remember this exactly. He said something, so there was a lot of incendiary, inflammatory language like go fight, fight like hell, things like that. But he also said go in peace, and he ended it with that. Now the counterexample I would give, and we have to be very, very careful here if we have a very loose, expansive concept of intentional incitement. What about a case that the ACLU had before the Supreme Court 2 years ago when we were representing DeRay McKesson, a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement, who was giving a very incendiary, inflammatory speech somewhere in, Louisiana, I believe, in favor of Black Lives Matter, against police violence, a lot of language against police officers in general, against law enforcement in general, against white people in general. And while he was giving that speech, somebody in the crowd threw a rock and injured a police officer. Now, no mistake about it, the person who actually commits the physical violence, along with the people who actually invaded the Capitol, of course, they are personally responsible and accountable. The only question is whether that speaker who allegedly incited the violent, illegal conduct should also be held culpable. And the argument was made and accepted by 2 levels of lower courts in the McKesson case that even though he did not expressly urge somebody to throw a rock and attack a police officer, that the language did satisfy that standard. And the lawsuit was brought not only against him personally, but also against the Black Lives Matter movement. So, as I was making this explanation to a Wall Street Journal reporter, and he summarized and he said, oh, so you're saying that what's good for Black Lives Matter is good for Trump, and vice versa. So it's sort of the inverse of Nat Hentoff, free speech for me, but not for thee. So that's the question I would pose to that student. Would you also want to punish the leader of Black Lives Matter in comparable circumstances?
Those are tough questions.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, then we're going to open it up for members of the audience to come chat with you. And that is about the public square. This idea has had a fair amount of history behind it, but in recent years, there's been this question about, well, where is the public square today? If you don't physically have a place where you can go out and talk to one another, if it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever the social media platform is, are those the public square? Is that functionally where we're having political discourse today? And the related question is, what obligations do they and do they not have in terms of the speech that's being disseminated over those channels?
These are incredibly difficult questions that are now before the U.S. Supreme Court in a number of decisions. And what is complicated and difficult is, as a factual matter, clearly the social media platforms are the dominant public square. In fact, in a case back in 2017, the Supreme Court made a statement which has become even more true since then. The Supreme Court said it used to be debatable what is the most important public square in terms of the opportunity to exchange ideas among ourselves and with government officials. And the Supreme Court said that is no longer debatable. Clearly, the answer is the internet in general and social media in particular. So as a factual matter, that is the dominant public square. But that raises a legal question, which is, should these private sector platforms be given the same First Amendment legal status that the traditional public square, namely government-owned streets and parks and sidewalks, have, where they have to be open to all comers in a viewpoint-neutral way? And the hesitation in reaching that conclusion, well, first of all, I'll make a point that not everybody knows. The First Amendment does not bind any private sector entities. Even if they function as a public square, they are private sector entities. Therefore, they have no First Amendment obligation at all. They don't have to honor the viewpoint neutral principle. To the contrary, they have the same First Amendment rights that traditional media have, which is the right of editorial discretion to decide we are going to host certain speakers and certain ideas, but we're not going to host other speakers and other ideas. So on the one hand, you have the First Amendment rights of these private social media companies. They should be free from government taking away their First Amendment editorial discretion rights. On the other hand, you have the practical reality that for the rest of us, if we don't have equal access to these very powerful platforms, we're denied meaningful freedom of speech. So different solutions are being voiced by people who oppose government taking away the First Amendment rights of these platforms, and those include antitrust remedies that might bring about more alternative platforms. They include privacy legislation that would allow all of us users to control and have information about the algorithms that these companies are using to filter what we see and what we don't see. Sort of a techie wonky approach is called interoperability. Organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation have long argued that these companies should be required to allow access to other software that would allow other filtering opportunities, so we individual users could determine what feeds we would get and not get, so to remove the centralized gatekeeping power.
It's heavy. It's a lot there. I'm going to ask our team to set a couple of microphones. I think this is where, if there are members of the audience who would like to ask Nadine some questions about any of these topics, and while we set those up, yeah, you can cycle around maybe as you go. I would just maybe remind everybody, this conversation is intended to be one that is based in a common sense of respect and dignity for one another. So I'd ask you to bear that in mind as we go through this Q&A. All right. Other questions from the audience?
Sure.
There's our first.
Great talk so far. It's been really incredible. It's good to hear from you. I'm actually starting my law school journey this fall, so
Congratulations.
I'm excited for that. My question is, so I was on Instagram Reels earlier today, and I saw a video of Joe Biden promising that if he wins the 2024 election, he will bet the entire budget on one hand of blackjack, and if he wins, he'll forgive all of our student loan debt. Obviously, that's fake. But my question is, what should we do with misinformation, especially in the context of deep fakes, and how should the people creating kind of these humorous and also sometimes quite serious and misleading posts be treated? So.
Excellent question. And as I alluded to earlier, first of all, congratulations on your impending law school and legal career. As I alluded to earlier, the concept of disinformation or misinformation, I'm putting it in scare quotes, has the same vulnerability as the concept of hate speech, that it's very subjective. And what one person considers in this case to be, clear, as you say, clearly satirical and humorous, right? It's possible somebody else would consider it to be dangerous disinformation. They might think that there are members of the public who are going to be dissuaded from voting for Joe Biden because they're so naive that they'll believe this. Or maybe people would be persuaded to vote for him because they think it's a good policy. And as is true for speech with hateful content, there are certain subcategories of false or misleading expression that do satisfy the emergency standard and can and should be punished. So before explaining why I think we should not go beyond that, I want to make clear that there are sensible guardrails in place. So intentionally false or recklessly false statements that damage somebody's reputation and cause demonstrable, usually financial or professional harm, can be punished as defamation. Intentionally making a false statement to somebody, intending somebody to rely on that statement, and they rely on it to their detriment, that is punishable fraud. And one final example is perjury, where you intentionally lie in a court of law or legal proceeding and undermine due process of law or the rule of law. But when we get beyond that to this much looser, more subjective concept, again, the disinformation and the misinformation can do a great deal of harm. There is no doubt about that. But it is even more harmful to empower the government to make those determinations. There are, like, we can use COVID as an example. During the pandemic, many countries enacted and enforced laws against disinformation about the pandemic and about government policies in response. And without fail, all of those laws were used to punish anybody who dissented from or criticized or even questioned government policies. And we know in a rapidly unfolding situation, today's truth may become tomorrow's falsity and vice versa. We saw the very same government experts and agencies in the United States changing what they considered to be true or false, good or bad with respect to COVID policies, right? Masking being a prime example. And so especially if you want to further the search for the truth, it's especially important to allow all perspectives, including those that might be false but have to be subject to falsifiability. Now what do we do to deal with the problem of deep fakes and other kinds of disinformation? We have to engage in the strongest possible form of critical information skills, media literacy, information literacy. A number of states have now passed laws mandating that kind of education starting at the earliest levels of education, pre-K. Because even the strongest, the most authoritarian government could not completely eliminate all misinformation, right? So, my economist friends say we can't completely eliminate the supply. We have to focus on the demand side, make people not demand that disinformation or immunize them from accepting it if they are exposed to it.
I want to have a bit of a dialogue about. You said the Supreme Court's been very good at protecting First Amendment rights. I'm wondering if you could elaborate, especially since we're in an educational setting, how that really squares with Tinker versus Des Moines and Morse versus Frederick and the school's ability. I understand that those were high schools and we're at a university, but the school's ability to limit student free speech if it is endorsing illegal drug use or allegedly, or substantially disrupts the educational process.
Yeah, thank you so much. And when I said that the Supreme Court has been good on free speech, that's a generalization. Believe me, there are many exceptions, cases where I think the Supreme Court decided incorrectly. Morse versus Frederick, 5-4, clearly a bad decision. But I'll take your question more generally about how has the Supreme Court ruled about students and, by the way, teachers' rights in the K through 12 situation. And starting with Tinker versus Des Moines, by the way, every single one of these was an ACLU case, I'm proud to say. Starting with Tinker versus Des Moines, which is still good law and basically set a very speech protective standard for students and teachers back in 1969. The Supreme Court very famously said the Constitution does not stop at the schoolhouse gate. Neither teachers nor students shed their free speech rights as the price of admission to the schoolhouse. And basically, in that context, and what it's talking about is the right of teachers and students to express their own views in non-disruptive ways outside of a classroom context. So, of course, you don't have the right to make a political speech for or against any candidate or any cause in the middle of math class. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, in the lunchroom, in the cafeteria, in the hallway, or, outside in the, during recess period or so forth. The specific facts in that case involved a black armband that was being worn by students to protest the Vietnam War and to mourn people who had been killed in the war. So that was not disruptive. It wasn't interfering with anybody's education, except the argument was made, and this is very pertinent in particular to one of the questions that you asked earlier, Christy, and that is, at that time, to criticize the Vietnam War was extremely unpopular. The case began in 1965, and so the anti-war protest was just barely beginning. And in that school in Des Moines, Iowa, many of the students and teachers had family members who were fighting in Vietnam, who had been killed in Vietnam. And you better believe that they were profoundly upset by seeing even a non-disruptive protest, because the idea was very offensive. It was seen as deeply unpatriotic to be critical of the war. It was personally extremely upsetting because it was implicating the value of the lives of your fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers who were being killed there or exposed to being killed there. All of the arguments that are made today for suppressing offensive, traumatizing, controversial speech. And the Supreme Court, it had such wonderful language. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to quote it, but it was basically talked about the hazardous freedom that we have. Yes, it is hazardous to be exposed to ideas that are upsetting and offensive, but that is the course we have chosen in our democracy, and you are never too young to enjoy those rights. And what the court held in that situation was it imposed the school version of the emergency principle, right? It said only if the speech directly and materially undermines the educational process or directly violates the rights of others. Only in those extreme circumstances may you punish the speech. You may never punish it because you disagree with the idea or because you consider the idea to be offensive. After Tinker, there were a series of cases involving student speech, including Morse versus Frederick, in which the Supreme Court consistently ruled against student free speech, and it continued to reaffirm Tinker, but it made exception after exception until 2 years ago, and I'm blanking out on the name of the case. It was a case from Philadelphia, and it involved, or somewhere in Pennsylvania, and it was also an ACLU case. You'll remember it as the case of the cussing cheerleader, and that was so important because it was the first time since 1969 that the Supreme Court really not just paid lip service to Tinker, but really reinforced it. And it did so in a very factually important context, which is a student's social media post on her own time, outside school premises, outside school hours. It was a weekend. She was at a convenience store. She sent this message that used the F-bomb over and over and over again. Okay, I can say it here, you know. She had not been accepted for the cheerleading squad, so she says, you know, fuck the coach, fuck cheerleading, fuck the whole school. And the school suspended her, saying that because the message was about school officials and it was talked about at school, that that was disruptive and that that should constitute a material and substantial disruption that could be punished under Tinker. And the Supreme Court, it went back to the correct understanding of Tinker. It said the fact that people are upset about the idea or about the verbiage that she used, that is not a justification for suppressing it. It didn't actually interfere with somebody going to class or somebody studying in class or the teacher teaching in class. And in very, very strong language, the court said, schools are nurseries for democracy. It is especially important that unpopular perspectives and unpopular expression be subject to protection, because that is the cornerstone of our democracy. And I took that as and not only me, but many observers saw this as not only a very, very strong reinforcement of free speech for students and teachers in the school system, but clearly the court was sending a larger message that reverberates on campus and in larger society as well.
First, I'd like to say thank you so much for coming. My question is a little bit more of a moral rather than legal question. So for some background, there are some public universities that have what they call free speech sections. So students who want to convey a message are required to go to a certain square, maybe that's made of brick like our school, or certain other locations. So my question to you is, do public universities have a moral obligation to not restrict a public forum?
Yes, and the term that many campuses use is a free speech zone, and it's very ironic because typically it will be a very small area of campus that's very remote and makes it practically impossible, or at least very difficult and challenging to convey a message and to have an audience for your message. And in fact, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, has brought many challenges to free speech zones, and to the best of my knowledge has won every single one of those lawsuits. And quite a few states now have adopted legislation that outlaw free speech zones and say that campuses have not only a moral, as you say, but an educational responsibility, a responsibility that consists with their pedagogical mission and with their mission of educating and training and preparing citizens of our democracy to exercise their free speech rights and to engage with others. They have a moral responsibility for areas of the campus that are inherently and organically open, the big grassy areas, the areas in front of the student union and so forth, that presumptively the whole campus is a free speech zone, and the non-free speech should be the exception rather than the rule.
So I just wanted to think more like globally and internationally, because I think this is a wonderful conversation, but do you think with the rise of access to information via globalization and social media, we can see an uprise in threats to state sovereignty, such as with the Arab Spring, or is it more likely states will attempt to restrict free speech?
That's a very interesting question, and the answer probably varies around the world, not only due to social media, although that's certainly a very important factor. But I'm thinking a few months ago I spoke in the Czech Republic, and by the way, that's where I got this cap, from a free speech organization in the Czech Republic. The head of that organization had the idea for the design, and I was just salivating over it, so he gave it to me. Hint, hint. But anyway, I was talking to a group of students there who had come from all over Europe, and many of them said to me, we don't think of ourselves as Czech or Austrian or French. We think of ourselves as Europeans. And I thought, well, that's very interesting, and that has to do with the political development, economic development, and cultural development of the formation of the European Union. I think what you're talking about is are the cultural forces that have brought about a tremendous amount of cross-fertilization and cross-pollination. Certainly culturally, in terms of entertainment, in terms of language. I travel all over the world, and English has become, if you want to try to speak another language, it's almost impossible, because English has become so ubiquitous thanks to social media and YouTube and everybody watching everything in English. On the other hand, your question is very thought-provoking, so you're hearing me think aloud. On the other hand, we do have a resurgence of nationalism all over the world, including in the United States and in many European countries and South American countries as well. This has been a subject of great commentary, and it could be that it's like the pendulum swinging, that as a reaction to increasing globalization and cultural homogenization, that creates a pushback and a reaction to reassert national identity. And I think that's, we're going to continue to see those pendulum swings, hopefully preserving the best of universality and globalization, as well as the best of national traditions. I certainly would hope that the strong free speech tradition in the United States could be something that would have more of a global impact.
Hi, I just want to say thank you. This was such a great dialogue. I do want to ask you, what is your advice for students or individuals that don't feel like their opinions or ideas doesn't fit in to the maybe educational systems or environment that they live in, or even household, and they're almost like the black sheep of the family? Or I just want to know, what is that piece of advice that you want to give them? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to make a comment, which is, before I answer your question, I make about 200 public presentations per year. I've been doing that for many, many, many years. And there is one thing that is so striking and so unusual about the audience questions I'm getting here. Anybody have any idea what it is? I almost never get questions from women. I have had, and so many of the questions here have been from women, and I've compared notes with speakers, ask Brett Stevens or others who are going to be here, and so many of us, especially women who are speakers, will say that to each other and compare notes, and I can't tell you how many times after I'll give a talk, and then people will come up individually. I get a lot of women coming up to me asking great questions, and I'll say, but why didn't you ask that question during the opening presentation? I've heard many theories as to why that's the case, but I want to really salute you and thank you and for creating the environment that makes people who too often do not participate to participate here. So to your excellent question, all of us are minorities or so-called black sheep in particular situations, and it can be very tough and very unpleasant. I really will not minimize the difficulty of doing that, especially if you are going to be unwittingly hurting somebody else's feelings or disturbing them. I mean, let's say a family situation. You have a strong disagreement with people you love, your parents or your siblings, about an issue that is deeply important to all of you. You have a choice, and neither one of them is a particularly pleasant choice. On the one hand, you can air the disagreement, and it may be it may spoil the mood. It may spoil the atmosphere. I think that's why we had the old saying when I was growing up, and my students tell me that they hear it too, at the dinner table, don't discuss politics or religion, I mean the divisive topics. On the other hand, if you're avoiding the topic, that's not pleasant either if it's something that is very important to you. So I would, there are people who are experts on how to do this. I'm not an expert, but I've read a lot of websites and a number of books, and there are actually exercises and scripts that they give you, including down to the Thanksgiving dinner table. And, I've read, I think one of the guidebooks came from PEN, which is an organization that's at the intersection of journalism and free speech, and they put out a guidebook, I think it was last Thanksgiving, but using other examples beyond the family dinner table, and they really are very concrete. Suppose your great aunt says X, and you think that X is wrong, and they work you through how to deal with it. And it's usually involves not just blurting out your different opinion, and certainly not saying something critical, but it usually involves empathetic listening. So you first ask the person, I think you made this point, I want to be sure I understood you. So you paraphrase it, and that shows them the respect that you are actually listening to them. And that actually can serve a very powerful connecting function in and of itself. And then rather than immediately springing to your disagreement, you try to understand why it is that they have that view. And it's best to ask a personal question, such as, oh, can you tell me an experience you had that gave you that contributed to that perspective? So you're trying to understand them as a human being and not just associate them only with that idea, but to understand what brought them to that idea. And then sometimes you say something such as, well, would there be anything that you could experience that might give you a different perspective? So I'm not an expert, as I'm saying, but you can find these kinds of scripts which are useful in a whole variety of situations, including very impersonal ones and very, very personal. But I think what we're trying to do is to relate to each other as full-fledged human beings, recognizing that this is not just a person with whom we disagree on this particular issue, important as that is. This is a person who has had many experiences and has many perspectives, some of which are very positive and that we can relate to in a positive way.
I think that's a great point that, I mean, it really illustrates the idea of, sure, you have free speech, you can say anything. Should you? You know, and I think civility underlying that conversation and what we do here at CMU is critical. And, you know, here we've talked about sex, politics, and religion tonight, and no tables were thrown, not that I can see just yet. But I think we can have those hard conversations if we do it and we start from a point of respect. And I know with our committee, we do that. I couldn't tell you anyone's political ideologies in our committee. I don't really need to know, because we have this underlying passion for not only free speech, but the civility that surrounds it.
Right. You know, to paraphrase what you said so well, Christy, I say in my book, the fact that you have a right to say something does not mean that it is right to say something, right? So the freedom of speech is the freedom to choose both what to say and what not to say. And self-censorship is sometimes a very good thing, right? In some sense, you could say it's editing, it's advocacy, it's rhetoric, it's persuasion, it's trying to communicate in an effective way. And usually, communicating in a civil and respectful way is an effective way to convey your message.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to, as we wind down, maybe a couple of observations. One is this night simply would not have been possible without the work of Christy and the whole committee, and I just want to maybe pause for a moment, and if you would help join me in thanking Christy and the whole committee and Free Expression. Really appreciate your leadership and your work on this. I love wrapping with this idea of the way we talk to one another, and that there really is a better way to do that work. And so I'm grateful to be on a campus where we've been able to articulate these values. There's a variety of initiatives and efforts on this campus to getting at this question of just because we can doesn't mean we should. We might edit that to say just because we can doesn't mean we should, without any boundaries, and this idea that we can go about these hard conversations in a respectful way. So I want to acknowledge the Constructive Dialogue Institute and the work that our communications faculty have done to try and create these conversations. I know our friends at the Dignity Index are actually with us today and did some work with our did some work with our faculty, and I think these conversations can continue to improve, and rooms that are full like this give me hope that they will. So with that, help me give a final thank you to our special guest, Nadine Strossen, for really an outstanding evening.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you both so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.